Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Marianne Mader. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Association of Science Centers, and I will be your moderator today for today's panel that I'm very excited about. I've been waiting all week for this. We have a great lineup of speakers. So we'll be here with some of Canada's finest minds, quite frankly, in science communication, misinformation research, and public health interventions. We're going to dive deep into a discussion on innovative tools to debunk COVID-19 misinformation. So we know that throughout the pandemic, there's been a significant increase in misinformation and conspiracy theories surrounding public health and science that, quite frankly, have threatened the health and safety of Canadians. Misinformation has greatly contributed to vaccine hesitancy and distrust in public health measures, and it's led to anti-mask and anti-lockdown rallies, for example. And more importantly, underserved and marginalized communities have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19. And that's due to inequities in our healthcare system. So this panel will unpack some of the background research, tools, and strategies that have been used in tackling COVID and vaccine misinformation. Before we get into the panel, though, I do want to take a moment and ground us in this place where we're all joining from. And we're going to do ground us in it through a land acknowledgement. So although we're joining all virtually, it's important to take this moment, to acknowledge the original homelands of the distinct living Indigenous cultures where you are. I'm joining from Ottawa on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin people. I also want to take a brief moment to talk about why we do these acknowledgements, which have become pretty commonplace in these meetings and these events, I'm sure, within your own organizations. These acknowledgements demonstrate respect for the traditional custodians of a particular region or area. And they serve to remind people who are not Indigenous, such as myself, that they are guests in these territories and that these territories had complex and culturally specific legal, governance, education, and justice systems prior to the creation of Canada. So they really help us to reframe relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in a way that acknowledges Indigenous peoples have inherent rights in their territories. So I personally use these moments of land acknowledgements to reflect on my commitments and actions in support of truth and reconciliation. And I really hope you can do the same now and going forward when you hear these acknowledgements at events that you may be at. So I'm going to move into how this panel is going to go down, what our run of show looks like for today. We have 5 distinguished speakers. Each panelist is going to share some remarks. There's going to be an opportunity for maybe 1, if we're lucky, 2 clarifying questions before we move on to the next speaker. And then we're going to save time at the end for open Q&A. Now, open Q&A works by you using the Q&A tab in your bottom menu in this conference platform. We're also going to use the discussion forum, but mostly to share links from what presenters are sharing. That's where you can kind of go for background information, resources, links. Please put your Q&A in the Q&A box. That's where we're going to be looking for those questions. So who are our panelists today? Well, we have Timothy Caulfield, who's the Canadian Research Chair in Health, Law and Policy and the Research Director of the Health Law Institute at the University of Alberta, first up. Second up, we have Jia Hu, who's the Medical Officer of Health for Alberta Health Services and a prof at the University of Calgary. And he's also the chair and co-founder of 19 to 0, which I think you'll hear about. We have Patrick Sullivan, who's a Senior Research Assistant at Morningstar Lodge at the University of Saskatchewan. We have Dr. Krishana Setkar, who is currently the Science Advisor for the Science at First Initiative, which is a national anti-misinformation campaign that aims to combat misinformation around COVID. And wrapping up, we have Anthony Morgan, who is a science communicator, experience designer, PhD researcher, and former segment host of Discovery Channel's Daily Planet. So a great lineup, okay? We're going to start off with Tim as he moves to the main stage, and we're going to tell you a little bit more about Timothy. Maybe you've seen him on Netflix, maybe he had a show there, User's Guide to Cheating Death, or read one of his national bestseller books. He's won numerous awards, and he's published over 350 academic articles. That's incredible. His interdisciplinary research, he does it on topics like stem cells, genetics, research ethics, the public representations of science, and public health policy. Oh, so wide range. So welcome, Timothy, to the stage, and we can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Marianne. It's a pleasure. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk with you and to be with this fantastic team about what I think is just an incredibly important topic. And Marianne, you already touched on it. We are going to be talking about the infodemic and how much harm it is doing. And there is a real growing body of evidence that we can draw on that tells us about how much damage the infodemic is doing. It's absolutely everywhere, everywhere. And I think the other interesting thing that's happening is it's becoming so much about ideology. It's becoming so much about politics, and that creates real challenges for those of us who are trying to fight this infodemic. In fact, there was some interesting research that came out just over the past couple of weeks that found that those who are vaccination hesitant say they are as much for ideological reasons as they do for misinformation about the harms around the vaccine. So ideology creating a real challenge. But I think it's also important to recognize the degree to which this is about social media, right, Marianne? And that's why Science Up First, our initiative, focuses so much on social media. Again, a growing body of evidence tells us this is largely, not entirely, obviously, but largely a social media phenomenon. Interesting research, for example, including stuff from McGill in summer of 2020, found that if you get your information from Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, more likely to believe misinformation, more likely to spread misinformation. So we know that social media really matters. And if we're going to fight misinformation, we got to go to where misinformation resides. In fact, we actually have data that tells us the degree to which it's about social media. And there's been a lot of studies on this. This is a really interesting study that just came out of the University of Alberta, where they actually tried to put a number on it. Now, it's hard to do this research well, but I kind of agree with this. What they found is about 85% of all the misinformation that's circulating out there had as its origin story social media. So yeah, this really does matter. And Marianne, in your introduction, you talked about how it's getting worse out there. Well, this is from this number, 437%. 437%. This was an analysis that came out in August, and it found that the misinformation around things like, the vaccine doesn't work has increased 400% since the Delta wave. Found that misinformation about things like Bill Gates and the microchip up over 150%. So the volume of misinformation continues to rise. And I think there's growing recognition that this is a problem. This 95% up here. This was an interesting study that came out, again, just weeks ago, that found that 95% of Americans now recognize the spread of misinformation as a serious problem. An earlier analysis in Canada found it was 96%. So we're winning. By the way, it should be 100%. But I love the fact that this many people in the general public now know this is a serious problem. And how much damage is it doing? Well, again, a very recent study that came out from the US that found that 8 in 10 Americans are at least open to or are in fact believe one of the big COVID conspiracy theories. So this information is out there. People are believing it, and it is doing real harm. Yes, I don't think it's hyperbole to say it's killing people. It's killing people. So this really does matter. So the reason we're here today, the big question is, what can we do about it? Is there a response? Well, I think there is, and those of you who know my work are probably sick of me saying this, but I'm going to say it again. Debunking works. It really does work. Now, a lot of people don't like the term debunking, and I can kind of sympathize with that. It sounds very unilateral. It sounds combative, but that's the term of art that's out there. And the good news is, again, growing body of evidence tells us it really does work. It may not feel like it works, but it really does work, especially if it's done well. And we'll come back to what doing it well means in this conversation. But it really does matter. And Marianne, I think it's also important to recognize, debunking isn't easy. I want to take a little bit of a segue here and talk about how challenging it can be to be out there battling misinformation. There have been a lot of really interesting studies that actually put a number on it. This was an interesting study. It was in Nature. It came out just weeks ago again, that found that 15% of those individuals who are out there on social media fighting misinformation have received death threats. An earlier study found that 91% of those prominent individuals on social media have received abusive behavior. And absolutely, this is worse for women and people of color. So we really need to figure out ways, not only that we can debunk, that what are the best evidence-based strategies to debunk, but we got to figure out ways that we can support those that do it. Because holy cow, we need those trusted voices. We need people out there debunking. We need people using evidence-based strategies to fight the noise. We can do it. And of course, I'm going to end with a shout out to Science Up First. Krishana's going to come back to this. But Science Up First, our attempt to do exactly what I've just described, use evidence-based strategies to fight misinformation. So I'll end there just to warm up the audience with some obvious points. Curious, everyone, if there's any questions that people might have.
Tim, I don't see questions yet, but I am encouraging the audience to put them in the Q&A tab. I have a few maybe like quick questions before we move on to the next speaker. One is, obviously you mentioned debunking works. And I'm curious if we need to worry about what some people call the backfire effect.
Yeah, this is a great question because you hear it all the time. Marianne, I actually hear it from journalists who'll say, there's no point in debunking because it just makes people become more entrenched in their views, or that you're just going to amplify the misinformation. Well, more good news. I think the body of evidence that we've received since about 2010, it tells us that the backfire effect is often overstated. Some of the biggest studies, and I think some of the most well-done studies, have found no backfire effect. So that's great news. And there's even research, in fact, some very recent research that tells us that we don't have to worry so much about that amplification concern, right? If you debunk well, if the content is there, that's what matters, right? In fact, the content even wins out over the form, right? Good, engaging content wins the day.
Yeah, and I have one more quick question because you touched on the subject at the end of what you were saying about the support needed for the people doing this work. I don't think we were having that conversation in the early days in our response online to COVID, and it's such an important part of the conversation now. Do you have any like quick ideas around that? We can come back to this in the broader Q&A at the end of the discussion as well.
Well, I hope we do come back to it because I think this is becoming increasingly important. I personally have been sued. I get death threats. People spread lies about me. Thankfully, there's this fantastic community out there, and we support each other. So we march onward. But I think institutions, universities, governments, research facilities, they've got to support those that are trying to fight misinformation. So I mean, support them with informing them about how to do good SciComm, but also support them in a very practical sense. So I mean that through legal support. In addition to that, I think they got to reward them for doing it. This isn't something that people should be doing just off the side of their desk. This is, I think, becoming increasingly a central role of being a professional, of being a researcher, of being a scientist, of being an academic. So we've got to reward them for doing it. We have to recognize that this is part of their job. This is part of knowledge creation and knowledge translation.
Incredible. Well, thanks, Tim. We're going to come back all together at the end. Now we're going to bring Dr. Jia Hu to the stage, who again is a medical officer of health for Alberta Health Services in Calgary and a prof at University of Calgary. And he also works at an inner city family medicine practice serving marginalized populations. He's the chair and co-founder of 19 to 0. This is a coalition of public health, academia, government officials, civil society organizations, and private sector partners with a primary focus on COVID-19 behavior change and vaccine uptake. So his areas of interest include pharmaceutical policy in low to middle income countries, immunization policy, and primary care and public health systems. So welcome to the stage. Take it away.
Thank you very much. Oh, such a long intro. I'm a big fan of debunking and also the visuals, Tim. Very well done there. Um, so I guess today's talk is a bit about innovative tools to debunk misinformation, and I'll focus on two things. I primarily now lead 19 to 0, which is this big coalition we formed about a year ago to try to basically get people to follow public health guidelines and nowadays just take the vaccine. One of these approaches I think is not would sound particularly innovative, but maybe it is a little bit in our sort of siloed environment. And the other sounds a bit more innovative. It involves machine learning and AI stuff. And so, I think one thing that we've been doing, that a lot of people have been doing, that I think is really cool about the pandemic is just our approach to what I call community outreach. And, I think across society, there are so many people who want to encourage vaccine uptake, and there's so many champions. And, indeed, these groups, they could be within schools or companies, NGOs, really all walks of life. Not only do they want to do this, I think they really hold the trust of the population we want to inform. And to Tim's point, ideology is so wrapped up in all of this that, I think having trusted voices is maybe more important than kind of anything. And so across the pandemic, we've partnered with, supported, leveraged, worked together, whatever you want to say, with probably thousands of organizations across society, ranging from schools to companies, big and small, to NGOs serving vulnerable communities. And yeah, I think this has been quite critical because I think there has been so much misinformation or even a lack of information around what people know and don't know about COVID. And, traditionally, I think in public health and in health, we do focus more on traditionally vulnerable communities, which is good. And there's been tons of really excellent work done around racialized communities, refugees, indigenous communities. But, right now, for example, we see the lowest vaccine uptake and the highest amounts of information in rural areas. So one thing that we're really doing now is partnering with organizations that have credibility there. So in Alberta, big project in northern Alberta with champions like oil sands companies and evangelical churches and 4-H clubs and those sorts of things. And I think it just speaks to the fact that if we can mobilize enough of society, we can activate more voices, more trusted voices to debunk. And so, not innovative in the traditional sense of the word, but I've seen a lot more de-siloing during this pandemic than ever before, which is really awesome. The other thing that we do that I'll mention that maybe comes across more innovative is sort of our machine learning and natural language processing on social media. So we all know that there's a lot of crap on social media, and I think a lot of organizations do what I call qualitative social media listening. And so you have a sort of general sense of what's being said, who's saying those things. But one thing that we've been doing for the past year, and I'm not an expert in machine learning or anything, is basically using natural language processing algorithms to basically analyze every single social media post, like on Twitter, on CrowdTangle, which is what contains Facebook and Instagram and Reddit data. And I think doing so, really allows one to quantify the discourse. And by that, I mean, I could say that over the past year, when it comes to adult immunization and COVID, about 70% of tweets have been actually pro-vaccine and 30 have been anti-vaccine. But when we move towards the pediatric space, we're seeing more of a 50-50 split. So a lot more anti-vaccine tweets in the pediatric space. And, if I look at sort of the reasons for why people are saying they don't want vaccine, very early on, like a predominant narrative was mistrust in government institutions, public health. And then for a while, it kind of dipped down, and safety signals when AstraZeneca was around became very predominant, and we're sort of back to mistrust of institutions and elites. And so I think being able to quantify what's being said allows, I guess, a measured quantitative response in terms of what particular messages we're dispelling. The other thing that this sort of approach allows us to do is form these network maps of the most influential people in pro and anti-vaccine spheres. And one of the kind of interesting things that happened actually with the pandemic is that a lot of sort of conservative politicians were sort of living right in between the pro and anti-vaccine space. Like one of the worst things that, Aaron O'Toole could do, and he'd never be like, don't get a vaccine. He'd criticize Trudeau. And as a result, people who are conservative are like, okay, I don't trust Trudeau, I don't trust government, huge following. And that actually was more pernicious to vaccine uptake than, a lot of like overtly anti-vaccine things. And so I think with those things, it allows for, I guess, targeted individual interventions. And so at various points, we did email some of these conservative politicians to encourage them to be more unabashedly pro-vaccine. And I think understanding the discourse quantitatively is helpful. It's not the full solution, like it's just knowing the landscape of what's happening. But I think it's a good starting point for all the debunking and the interventions on social media in the real world that need to take place otherwise. So yeah, those are two things that have happened that I think have been kind of fun and maybe a little bit innovative. So thank you.
Group has been doing. Maybe just a really quick follow-up is just maybe unpacking a little bit more the best ways that you've seen in addressing misinformation on social media, especially given that you kind of have access to these really detailed information about what are the kind of emerging themes to address.
Yeah, so I mean, I think one thing is I think generally people kind of post in their own echo chambers, which is not very useful, right? Like I'm in a pro-vaccine group, you'll post. So like it's knowing where to post your posts. I think that's one thing. Knowing what messages are the best ones to post. And realistically, there's only so many anti-vaccine tropes, right? There's like it causes infertility, or, it's got microchips in it, that's not particularly common. And then knowing how to engage and disengage with people, right? And it's sort of like how much time do you put in to, somebody who's like completely not going to be convinced, you don't want to spend too much time there. But I think the other thing about knowing some of those things is it applies outside of the social media world as well, right? So if we kind of know what the prevailing sentiment amongst, let's say, rural Albertan farmers are, when we have people talk to them, we can use the messaging that works with them versus what might work for an urbanite. So yeah, it's kind of like where you post, what you say, and how much time you spend with a particular person.
Thanks. And thanks to those, I see some questions rolling in the questionnaire. We're going to get to some of these topic areas. I think when we open up to general Q&A, I can see some questions around trust, around maybe influencers. So please keep those questions rolling in. I see that they're coming. But we're going to move on to our next speaker, who is Patrick Sullivan, a senior research assistant at Morningstar Lodge at the University of Saskatchewan. Patrick, I know you're going to introduce yourself as well in your remarks, but I am going to just say a little bit about from your bio, which states that as a non-Indigenous person, Patrick feels fortunate to work alongside Indigenous communities. And this work would not be possible without the many years that Morningstar Lodge's leadership has spent building mutually beneficial, trusting, ongoing, and authentic relationships with partnering Indigenous communities. That is work that takes time. So thank you. So welcome, Patrick, and the stage is yours.
Thank you, Marianne. I'm Patrick, and honestly, that intro was enough because the work isn't about me, it's about the communities, and I am here to present Morningstar Lodge, and you touched on the relationships in terms of an innovative tool. I mean, the relationships are the tool for us to combat misinformation and promote vaccine confidence. So I'll get right into it. And the lab, Morningstar Lodge MSL, it's located in Regina, but I'm presenting from Orangeville, Ontario. And that's Treaty 19 territory in the traditional lands of the Petun, Mississaugas, and Shniboweki and Haudenosaunee peoples. I'm going to start with this visual that just shows the diversity of people that could exist in a landmass. Pardon me? Oh boy. Well, off to a good start. For this visual, it shows the diversity that can exist in a landmass as large as Canada. And it'd be easy to see how difficult it would be to draw a conclusion that's accurate for Finland and Egypt and France and Afghanistan. And I think the same goes for Indigenous communities in Canada. So there's a lot of research or literature on the historical factors that increase hesitancy. But when we talk to a lot of our Indigenous partners, that's not necessarily their reality. And a lot of them have been really successful in promoting vaccine confidence. So pan-Indigenous conclusions do have some use, but really when it comes to hesitancy, you're not going to know what's happening in a community until you show up and ask. And I can really only speak to what's happening in the communities that we have relationships with. So Heidi Larson and the Vaccine Confidence Project, they've had a bit of a head start looking into all this stuff on the rest of us. And she describes hesitancy really as a relationship problem because misinformation alone isn't necessarily problematic. It's when people believe the misinformation. And if you already trusted accurate scientific information, there's not much room for you to then go believe a conspiracy theory. So trust is a big issue. And there's this quote here: when I know you care, I'll care about what you know. And back to Dr. Larson, her team found that online, anti-vax groups actually recruit undecided people at a rate 500% faster than pro-vaccine groups. The anti-vaxxers are more nimble, responsive, and they listen a lot better. They show that they care. They don't dismiss concerns or demonize people who have questions as anti-vax. So trust and showing we care are really important. And they're really important for building authentic relationships. And through these, you can, or at least at the lab, we combat misinformation. And we build trust into these relationships in a lot of different ways. For one, they can't be just convenient relationships, right? They exist before research takes place and continue to be maintained long after the research completes. And we do stuff, a lot of it comes down to respect, timely communication, flexibly responding to community priorities, adhering to cultural protocols, and really putting community first, right? And it's the respectful thing to do, but it does have the kind of additional benefit of building trust with these communities. It shows that our relationships are authentic. And these relationships most directly exist with community research advisory committees, or CRACs. So CRAC members are nominated by the communities that the CRACs represent and are normally elders and knowledge keepers, community researchers, but can be anyone who is nominated. CRACs are honestly really helpful. They act in an ethics exempt advisory role, and their guidance is actually one of the biggest ways that the lab supports self-determination. It's not exactly feasible to go into community and survey everyone to figure out what a priority is, but we can fairly easily set up a meeting with the CRAC and ask them what's going on. And here's the kind of general overview of what that looks like. We start by meeting with the CRAC and just asking them what they need or what's going on. And then we take this back to the lab and look for funding or create resources just in kind. And then we take these drafted responses back to the CRAC for an iterative collaboration where really all of our expertise comes together in an equitable way to create stronger outcomes. And these outcomes, they're not finished until they're approved by the CRAC. And once they're approved, we continue to take CRAC guidance through the process of knowledge mobilization. So next, I'm just going to cover some of the resources that have kind of come from this relationship-focused approach during COVID-19. Here's the vaccine fact sheet. It sounds kind of obvious, but the questions we answer, they have to be the questions of hesitant people. These are the questions our CRAC members have or are hearing in their communities. And if we're not actually answering those questions, we're not showing hesitant people that we care. And those anti-vax groups, they're responsive, and they're always there to listen. So we risk these people that are really on the fence being recruited by the anti-vax side of things. And here's the backside of the vaccine fact sheet. And here's another resource that came from request by community. It's a vaccine empowerment table, and it just lists the vaccines that are available and additional information, because sometimes you have to go to several different locations just to find all this stuff. So the community wanted something that was really all in one. And here's the backside, and I'm realizing it's probably time to update the authorized ages for use, but we'll get to that. And here's an FAQ that accompanies those sheets. Again, one of the ways we kind of try to lessen the effects of the infodemic is by making our resources as all-in-one as possible. So here are, this is the children's version of the All About Me booklet. This came from a partnership with Solutions for Kids in Pain, or SKIP, and a CRAC from Star Blanket Cree Nation. So these were adapted from something developed by the Alberta Health Services, and we just adapted it to make it a little more culturally appropriate and engaging for the communities that we work with. You essentially fill this out before your vaccine appointment and give it to whoever's providing the vaccine, so they have more information that they can use to make you more comfortable. And here's the adult version of the same booklet, really similar, but it includes more sensitive questions around trauma, as that's the unfortunate reality for a lot of the older Indigenous people that we serve. And here's some of the graphics of Little Louie. This came from that same SKIP and Star Blanket partnership. And Little Louie is an Indigenous children's book looking to promote COVID vaccine confidence. Essentially, a lot of the CRAC members from Star Blanket, they grew up without medical information that reflected or respected their culture. So they had firsthand experience of the need to really reverse this trend. And I guess just to kind of wrap things up and bring it back to that bigger question of dispelling misinformation and creating trusting environments, for us, it comes down to forming authentic relationships, trusting relationships. And if we just show up when there's a crisis, that's not exactly authentic. That's just convenient. So for the communities where we're still really struggling, I think the work probably had to start years ago. And of course, there's stuff we can do today, but I think it's important to identify these communities and prioritize them moving forward so that those relationships are in place the next time we have a major crisis like this. And I guess when it comes to building those relationships, honestly, maybe it's not a bad idea to take a page out of the anti-vax playbook and be empathetic to people that aren't anti-vaxxers yet, but do have their concerns. And any of the resources I chatted about are available there at indigenoushealthlab.com, one of the easier URLs to remember. And that's all I have.
Thanks so much. There's a lot of information in there to unpack. I heard listening, trust, being responsive, being culturally appropriate. We're going to come back to all of this again, I think, at the end of the discussion. Maybe one quick question. I don't know how quick this one is actually. That speaks to, there's no secret that historical research practices have eroded trust between academia and Indigenous communities. And so I'm actually wondering what effect of this history that Morningstar Lodge has observed during COVID, and how have you addressed these effects? So I know this might be a bigger question. We can save time at the end too.
Sure. No, it's a good question. Yeah, for those of us that are familiar with the literature, it's a laundry list of horrifically unethical misconduct that's occurred. And I think that trust, it's one of those things that takes a really long time to build and can be destroyed in an instant. So for some of these, especially older Indigenous people, it's possible that there's not a whole lot that can be done to repair multiple generations of broken trust. But certainly for the next generation, I think we redefine the relationship that exists. We can't change the past, but we can kind of form the future relationships that we want. So building those authentic relationships and showing the next generation of Indigenous people that it's different now, I think that's really useful. But I think it's important to note that when we in academia talk about Indigenous hesitancy, we almost always focus just on what makes it unique, which is the history. And especially this younger generation, they're on social media. They're using technology. So they're exposed to these same factors that are leaving, I don't know, is it hundreds of millions of people around the world hesitant or refusing still? So the history is important, and it's important that we know the history so that we better understand maybe where the lack of trust is coming from. But we need to be careful not to just simplify hesitancy to history because, again, there's these contemporary factors. And if we're limiting our understanding to just the historical, the effectiveness of our responses is going to take a hit because we're missing part of the picture.
Yeah, that's so important, the nuance of this work. It's not simple, it's not cut and dry. Thanks so much. I am going to bring Dr. Krishana Sankar onto the stage. So again, she's the science advisor for Science at First. I have to do a bit of bragging here. She's also an award-winning and published researcher with an expertise in cellular and molecular biology, and has presented at many places around the world, nationally, internationally. And she's been focusing on dispelling misconceptions around healthcare issues on social media and through community presentations for many years. So thank you for the work you're doing, and the stage is yours.
Awesome. I think you're seeing my presenter view, which is not the view that I want you to see. So 1 second. Let's try this again. All right. Is that better? Does that work? No, that's still not working. Let's try that again. And one last time. And it should be working now. Awesome. All right, I've got you now straight back to probably my last slide. But anyway, I am Prashana Sankara. Thank you so much, Marianne. And we've had a lot of phenomenal speakers so far. I'll try my best to stick to our time. I just wanted to do a land acknowledgement. So I'm joining today from Toronto, which is traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So today I'll be talking a little bit about Science Up First, which you heard about already from the awesome Tim who started us off. So Science Up First, massive online anti-misinformation campaign. It's actually an initiative by CASC, and it's in partnership with Resources Canada and the Health Law Institute at the University of Alberta, and we are also funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada. Now, I don't think I need to tell this crowd, but misinformation has been spreading like wildfire, specifically since the last year. And so why have an online social media campaign? Well, Tim alluded to this earlier. Lots of misinformation has actually been spreading via social media. So we actually need to be there. We need to be present where the misinformation is being spread. We need to be present where the people are at consuming their information, particularly because a lot of information has not been very easily available, specifically in easy to understand language. And lots of people that we know tend to go and consume their information and news on social media platforms. So Science Up First thought, why not? Let's create information. Let's create and use creative ways to share our best available science and scientifically accurate information to stop the spread of misinformation. And one of the ways we do this, and you may or may not be able to see this graphic that well, but what you can see in the image is a lot of circles, a lot of connections. And so that's essentially how Science Up First works, is that we collect a lot of information and data, whether it's from PHAC, whether it's from our followers and friends online, as well as experts, our coalition of experts. We brainstorm together, come up with all the different issues at hand that are timely right now. So for example, right now, we were talking about kids and vaccines and all the misinformation that's floating around there. And then our content team goes back, researches it, creates amazing content in easy to understand language. So when I say that, at a grade 6 reading level. And then we have amazing content producers that create really fun, engaging graphics. And then that content is then edited, well, not edited, but vetted, and if needed, edited by our experts before we then release it out onto the internet. So this is also then, we also bring in our community partners and as well as our other partners, but specifically our community partners with this. And so they are able to amplify and use this information in whichever way is best for their specific communities. And that's a little bit of how Science Up First works. So I'll take you a little bit through the impact we've had so far. So, it's good to know that we can be part of something that's actually making a difference. So right now, Science Up First has been able to, share all this content with over 360 million people. We've got over 450,000 engagements and lots of followers. So we can actually collect information on these types of details as well as where they're located, so provincially. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I'm not quite sure, but it would have been great to be able to collect information as well on the types, of communities that are actually getting this information as well, but that's very difficult to collect. And it's also really important that we know that we are reaching real people and that we are making a difference. So we collect qualitative data as well, right? Getting feedback from people on how we're doing, knowing that we're actually making a difference for some people who are appreciative of the work that's coming through, and to know that, okay, they are getting the accurate information that they're looking for. They're trusting Science Up First with this. And I know Patrick just spoke about trust, and trust is a huge one in what we do. As I said, we're able to monitor our audience, which is great. But what I want to come back to right now and sort of bring us back to a little bit specifically with what we're talking about today is Science at First is largely social media, but we are also aware that not everyone lives on social media or on the same social media platforms, or the fact that we at Science Up First may be able to get everyone we would like to get this information to. And so this is where the power of partnerships come in, especially when it comes to our community partners. So actually within this since this pandemic, a lot of marginalized and underserved communities we know have, of course, been disproportionately affected by COVID-19 for a vast array of reasons. But another big part of it, and so when it comes to the information part of it, is the fact that it's not that the information is not out there, it's just that it's not accessible to a lot of these different communities. So whether they be different racialized communities, immigrant communities, they're not either present in the language that people speak, they're not present in a culturally sensitive or relevant way. So they're not going to be consumed by people within these different communities. And that's a real issue. So in my communications with a lot of our different community partners, a few things that keep coming up are things like, well, they feel excluded and left out. And so I don't know about you, but at least for me personally, and then as well as a lot of my colleagues and friends who are also part of racialized and immigrant communities, something that we saw is a lot of misinformation being spread on platforms like WhatsApp. A lot of misinformation is spread on Facebook. And so people are going to go to people who they trust for the information that they're seeking. So when it came to vaccine hesitancy, or what I like to call vaccine confidence, a lot of low vaccine confidence, we actually saw this within certain populations, especially racialized populations. And I got a few of them highlighted here. And this information is from the Canadian Community Health Survey. And this was done last year over a population of 20,000 people. But just to note that, the fact is, this shows significant difference with those specific populations that just had very low vaccine confidence. And there are many different reasons around this, like distrust of societal structures that we mentioned before, and misinformation, disinformation, and lack of accessibility of accurate information, as well as other points. So something that we try to do, and Patrick mentioned this before, is it's really important that we develop really deep understanding with communities and build trust. Trust and long-lasting relationships with communities is very difficult and it takes time to build. And so this is something we come in, although it's been a short time, we've had to continually build this relationship, and we'll continue to build these relationships as we go on. Another way that we're doing this is through supporting our community partners. So some of the ways that we can do it, we have access to expertise, amazing networks, and of course our content. So a little bit of the recurring themes that I've been hearing from our community partners on calls is, misinformation circulating on WhatsApp and social media, right? Lots of stories of mistrust from years of past and present mistreatment of the people from within those communities. We're not surprised by this either. And then as well as feeling excluded because of the lack of relevant information. So right now, a couple ways in which we are tackling this at Science Up First. So we're actually doing town halls with a few of our different community partners, doing content co-creation with some experts, as well as community partners. So one example is a group called Christian Horizons. This group actually serves the disabled community, and they created an education program whereby we actually got involved and helped with the content creation for that, and been sharing expertise. Two in particular I'd like to touch on is a community integration model that we're doing with one of our community partners, and we hope to expand this, but basically we're able to supply some kind of financial support to one of our community partners, whereby we have someone who's integrated within that community. I'm so sorry, one second. Yeah, and whereby we're able to integrate one of our community support, provide some sort of financial support to a community partner that is integrated within the community. They will now take content from Science Up First and adapt it for their community. So for example, using languages that are spoken in the community, as well as modifying some of the content so it's culturally relevant to that specific community. So that's one of the things that we're doing. And another one, this is another fun one, collaboration between Science Up First and Science Everywhere. So you'll hear Anthony speak right after me and do his fun game. So using a very cool, innovative platform like Anthony's platform at Science Everywhere to engage different communities, especially youth, is really important and key. One of my conversations with someone from the Indigenous community, he was really expressing a lot of misinformation and conspiracy theories that has been spreading and consumed by the youth in his community. So having a platform like this would be extremely essential in helping to get especially our youth into the conversation so we can start to debunk and stop the spread of misinformation. So anyway, I'll stop us there. You know, we have a lot of things going on coming up next, but we can always chat more about that later. Thank you.
Thanks so much. You reviewed a lot of content, a lot of strategies. I'm going to start pulling questions from the audience now. One that rolled in, which I don't know if you touched too much on, but it speaks to what role could teaching people the tactics used by those spreading information, how could that help in our kind of fight against misinformation?
Yeah, you mean using misinformation? So I know Patrick touched on this.
I think the question was actually about teaching people those tactics that are used
to spread accurate information.
To spread that the tactics that are being used by people spreading misinformation.
Right. Okay. So then, yeah, for us to use that.
Hey, these are the tactics that are being used.
Yeah, and so I remember Patrick touched on this, but what he said was extremely true. And so a lot of the things that people who spread misinformation do, they are creating like catchy, easy to understand content, which is actually what Science Up First is doing, right? So we're actually doing that to combat misinformation, is have information that is accurate, but it's easy to understand. It has to be at like a grade 6 level. You have to be able to understand it. It has to be visually appealing as well. A lot of the listening and the empathy is extremely, extremely important. In a lot of my own conversations with people, a lot of times people feel very much judged for their stance and the questions that they have, but just being able to sit and have an open conversation, letting them know it's a judgment-free zone, welcome them into the conversation and trying to understand where they're coming from. Now, of course, it's not feasible to do on a large scale, but this is more on a one-to-one scale where we're having open ears and being compassionate to what people say and trying not to judge them for what they say. But then, you know, supporting them with accurate information, giving them access to the accurate information. I think those are a couple of tactics that we need to be using because in general, that's how we should be communicating with each other anyway.
How do people know, like, how can we help them recognize when something is misinformation? This question came from Derek. He had a few clarifying questions in the Q&A area. You know, there's some strategies around using kind of like portions of quotes from someone who may be influential in a way that helps spread it. So there's some kind of common tactics that are used. How can is sharing those tactics part of the solution as well?
Yeah, well, no, that's an excellent point. So knowing what people do who share misinformation is also very important. So knowing the fact that they would take, for example, a quote out of context to sort of, provide proof of what they're saying or sort of back up what they're saying is important to know. That's why we often say read beyond the headline. Also read the entire article and not just pick and choose, parts of it, because that's what people do to spread misinformation. Things like using outdated information as well. That's been done a lot, where we know, especially in this pandemic, what was true yesterday is not necessarily true today, and people sort of jumping on the bandwagon of something that was, said yesterday, which is no longer true today. And so spreading the misinformation that way is another tactic that they use. A lot of hyperbole as well. And Tim, I know Tim touched on this, but a lot of ideology is also being used to spread misinformation. So being grounded and rooted in scientific fact is what is really important for people to remember to use as a tactic when they're actually having conversations with those they're trying to help to sort of foster, move them towards accurate information.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot more to unpack in this conversation. I do want to move on to Anthony's segment. So Anthony Morgan, who, again, science communicator, experienced designer, PhD researcher, former segment host of Discovery Channel's Daily Planet. He's doing research now focusing on critical thinking, wisdom, science, and society. And I believe, Anthony, you're going to speak a bit to that, and then also walk us through an example, kind of an intervention that you've created to address the work. So take it away.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you so much, Marianne. I really appreciate being here with all of you guys. My colleagues have done a really amazing job of laying out some highly effective strategies for addressing misinformation and walking us into some of the tools that we can use to do so. And I'm sure a lot of us are excited to actually put some of this stuff into practice. I really loved what Patrick had to say about building councils of communities to help to do this, or using AI, or there's a lot that works really well. And you probably might even have somebody in mind when you think about who you want to try some of these techniques with. It might be the relative who is a problem at every holiday get together because they are constantly, they seem committed to being wrong or holding ideas that we don't like, and they might make your blood boil to talk to them. And finally, with this conference and all these tools, Judgment Day is finally here, and the weight of reason is going to come crashing down upon them, and they will have no choice but to finally see the light. And if you're feeling kind of excited about that idea, well, first, you're not alone. A lot of us feel that way occasionally, at least. But I want to make the case today that that might not be such a great idea, because it can come back to bite us in some surprising ways. And so, we really need to pick our battles carefully and thoughtfully. And so what I really want to help us do today is just figure out what are some strategies we can use to do just that, to pick our battles wisely, and to make sure that we're moving our communities to get forward together in the direction we are all hoping to. So I guess the first thing we have to do if you want to understand the problem, if you want to fix this problem, is to understand it a little bit better. And so, what do we do with those people who seem to be, the way that Tim spoke about, ideological in their thinking? They seem to be committed to being wrong in the face of unequivocally clear information. You might ask yourself if this is sort of a left-right problem, because sometimes it can kind of feel that way, that, it's just a coincidence that usually the side that is wrong happens not to be mine, but maybe one side is wrong more often than the other. And, so really you can ask yourself the question, is there one side that's worse at reasoning, right? Is there one side that has a tougher time with this, the left or the right? And there's actually a little bit of data to support that idea. So if we take, for example, if we take, for example, a chart like this that explores sort of, can't see the screen just yet? Okay, let me try and see if I can make sure you guys can see what I'm looking at. Are you able to see a chart? Nothing yet. Okay. Let's try that. I'm not sure which screen I'll want to do then. Oh, so maybe it's just lagging then. I'll try it again. I just stopped sharing. Okay, I'm going to share the entire screen, and then hopefully that should do the trick. And then we should be seeing like a little inception-y thing at first of my presenter view. Are we seeing Inception? It was a great movie if you haven't seen it. Okay. Well, I'm gonna just try to sort of clarify. So we've got this 2x2 grid that looks at what happened. Oh, awesome. We can see it now. So we've got this 2x2 grid of what happens when you introduce a ban on carrying concealed weapons in cities. And science literacy and science numeracy actually predict performance in interpreting this graph, which is because it's a pretty tricky graph to read. Read this and say, look, over 200 cities reported an increase in crime, and only 75 showed a decrease. So concealed carry bans, they don't work. Or they might say, like, look, over 200 cities showed an increase in the experimental condition, but only 100 did in the control condition. Carry bans, they don't work. But actually, the truth is it's the reverse. And to understand that, you would have to look at the ratio in the changes across conditions. And so it's true that in the experimental condition, crime did increase 3 times, but in the control condition, crime increased 5 times. And so it turns out that in this case, yeah, crime actually decreased, or at least didn't increase as rapidly as cities that didn't have a ban on concealed carry weapons. And so if you show a graph like this to liberals and to conservatives, liberals tend to interpret it correctly more often, especially if they have high numeracy skills. But that is unless you reverse the labels on the graph. Because if you do, and well, by the way, you can do that because this data is all fictitious. Okay. If you do reverse that, the labels, then the data is all fictitious. And so if you replace increase in crime with decrease in crime and vice versa, then conservatives actually get much better at interpreting this graph, where liberals had a tough time. In fact, the higher your numeracy and literacy skills are as a liberal, the worse you perform in interpreting this graph overall. And so, you know, to the question, do liberals or conservatives do a better job with interpreting this kind of stuff? Who's worse at reasoning, the left or the right? The answer is yes. We are both not very good at interpreting this kind of information. And it's because our ability to interpret data correctly doesn't depend on whether we're liberal or conservative. It depends on whether the data that we're perceiving threatens our political identities. I think that Tim already earlier sort of kind of comment. What's worse about this is that fMRI data seems to indicate that the more threatened our identities are, the less likely we are to update our beliefs with. And you know, the researchers who discovered this, they actually said that information, it's as though our brain encountered a bear in the woods. And this is part, I would argue, of why misinformation persists in polarized environments, because these social threat parts of our brain are hyperactivated. And so there's this instinct we have to say, I told you so, when people get things wrong. But this is where it comes back to bite us, because saying I told you so inflames the social threat response. It makes it much less likely that we'll update our beliefs. And so if saying I told you so isn't our goal, then what should our goal be? I would argue that we want goals that reduce social threats, you know, goals that turn down the bear response in our brain. And there are 2 ways I think we should be doing that. And they are build rapport and help explore. And so by build rapport, I don't mean just that we want to be respected. I mean that we want to be trusted as well, because with controversial science, there are often significant social costs to being on the outs with your in-group, right? We probably all know people who don't talk to their relatives as much as they used to because they either were or were not Trump supporters, or because they do or don't believe that abortions should be made more broadly available. And in these kinds of polarized environments, people become acutely aware of the indicators of who is us, who's within our in-group, and who is them, who is apart from our in-group, and they're not concerned with our well-being. So we might consider both the Canadian and Russian governments very capable of developing a safe vaccine. They might be respectable in that sense, but I might only trust one of them. I might only trust that one of them has my best interest at heart. And you know, I really loved what I think it was Patrick who said, I will care what you know once I know that you care. I think that's really the core of what we have to be aiming to do when we're building rapport. We need to demonstrate the communities that we're engaging with. And that's part of how you make yourself and us versus them. And so we know that scientists sometimes can have kind of a tough time doing this. You can see sort of in the chart of all the different kinds of professions that one might occupy. Scientists are very far along this kind of respectable end of the continuum, but they're not very high in warmth. So we're not, although we're respected, we're not as trusted as we might be. So we want to figure out how we might build trust. And part of that, I would argue, is non-judgmental, empathetic listening, or foregrounding some of the values that you share and the overlap in your beliefs. And the second part of the goals that I think we should be adopting are to help explore. We know from various models like the biopsychosocial model, or from motivational interviewing techniques that are used for treating chronic addiction or behavior change, we know that that helping to foster a sense of curiosity is quite an effective strategy. You know, part of what people are doing when they're trying to decide whether to trust you or trust the information you're sharing is they're trying to decide if you have the right goals. And so not wanting to prove them wrong, proving them wrong is not a great goal, because that doesn't seem like it's in line with what's in their best interests. And even wanting to be right is still suboptimal, because again, it's not focused on what is best for the community that you're engaging with. And so I would say, really, you want to aim to foster that sense of curiosity, because your goal in that case is a collaborative one. It's one that you share with your community. From research, that people high in science curiosity seem to be protected against some of those motivated reasoning challenges that we saw in the research that we already covered. And they tend to update their beliefs even when those beliefs challenge that they find themselves embedded within. So when your goal is to foster a sense of community or of curiosity, you make it obvious to people, and you make it obvious to people that that is your goal. You can turn down the social threat part of their brain. Telling them that you would like them to learn, telling them that you would like to learn from them, gives them the sense that, hey, I can bring this person into my us group. I can make them into us. And the benefit to you is that as you explore their thoughts, you probably start to unearth some of the inconsistencies in their beliefs. And doing that is part of the gradual march towards changing your mind about some of these more polarized ideas. So I don't want to just talk about these concepts. I want to give you guys the opportunity to actually try some of them yourself. So I'm going to screen that I'm sharing, and hopefully it'll stay up to speed with me. I'm going to share a link in the chat, because we're going to try one of the tools that Krishana spoke about it a little bit at the introduction, something we call freestyle socials. And freestyle socials are sort of a game they're meant to be a space where disagreements on the internet make you laugh instead of losing faith in humanity. And so the rules for that game are really simple. Basically, players will see a question, you'll pick sides. The questions are two-sided, you'll pick a side, and then we share ridiculous reasons to switch sides. And the only rule really is that laughing players have to switch sides. So I'm going to share a link in the chat, and we're going to try this game out. Hopefully we didn't lose too much time with with trying to figure out how to screen share. And let's see here. So there's a link in the chat where you can actually try this live.
And again, this link is in the discussion forum tab at the bottom of your screen.
That's right. Thank you. Yeah, so you can find that in the discussion forum tab of the screen. I'm going to go ahead and try to share the entire screen again, and we'll see if that does the trick. And you'll notice a question in the center of the screen. Oh, great. Tons of you guys have already found your way there. That's amazing. So you'll notice that, yeah, most people would choose to fight a black bear. You can choose the side you want to switch to by, there's little buttons at the bottom of the screen for bears on the left, and then horses is on the right. Very few of you would choose to fight horses, it seems. Oh, I guess the numbers are evening out a little bit. And I want to hear from you guys. And you can share your thoughts by clicking the microphone sort of in the bottom center of the screen. If you do that, please be aware that the game will ask for access to your camera and your microphone, and we'll be able to hear you. So if you're making use of the fact that in a digital conference you don't have to wear pants, then I would encourage you to put pants on before clicking the grab mic button. But anybody can just go ahead, grab the mic, say why they would pick one side or the other. This is more just to kind of get you guys acclimatized, and we're going to switch the question in a second. It seems like by a slight margin, the majority would choose to fight two small but angry horses rather than. And I'm really curious why. And while we're waiting for somebody to go ahead and grab the mic, what the the sort of purpose we're using this platform for in the context of research is we're looking to see whether play and playful environments can help to reduce polarization. And so we're testing this out with a number of different communities that identify as either strongly liberal, strongly conservative, strongly one side or strongly another with respect to any given controversial issue. And we're looking to see whether or not these kinds of playful and fun environments can really help to foster that sense of community, shared values, trust, that kind of building trust that every speaker before me has highlighted is really crucial to being able to engage with communities in ways that can reduce vaccine hesitancy or change attitudes on climate change. So feel free to go ahead and click either the grab mic button at the bottom or the microphone in the center of the screen. And you can hop on and say why you would either fight 2 small but angry horses or a black bear. And if that's not your cup of tea, I've got a bunch of questions banked, and we can try some of those out. Horses scare, okay, somebody says horses scare you more than bears, which is, I have to say I've asked this question a number of times and I have never heard that response before. So that's quite interesting. Yeah, that's actually another way that you can contribute to the conversation if you'd like. You can share your thoughts in the chat. I'm going to switch the question up though and ask, have aliens visited Earth? I know there are a number of communities who might count themselves as part of the scientific community, but who members of the scientific community might not count as in-group members or us members. And that's the reason I like questions like these, is it's an opportunity to kind of break down those silos and realize that, you know, even though we might disagree on one topic, we agree on another, and see that you would fight horses, so would I, and maybe we're on the same side for this one too. So it looks like believe that aliens, let me switch sides. Most people believe that aliens have not visited Earth, but it's not by the margin that I would have expected for the Canadian Science Policy Conference. You might perhaps be aware that the Pentagon is forming a task force to investigate some of these unidentified aerial phenomena. So I'd be really curious to hear from some of you guys. You can feel free to grab the mic. I guess most people aren't wearing pants today, so nobody doing that yet, but feel free to do so. If you're having trouble, it might also be that you need to use Chrome to do this. Okay, fair enough. So yeah, the research that we're doing is designed to, again, to ask people their beliefs on a range of issues that are polarized. We have them play this game. We have them build these kinds of relationships. We have them do this trust building. We have them do all the kinds of fun that allow communities to form. And then at the end of that, we look to see whether they have shifted any on the issues that we've asked them about by, again, having them fill out these surveys that measure their beliefs on a number of controversial issues. Go ahead, you're on the air. Okay, so I'm gonna, okay, fair enough. So I've never heard that response either before. I appreciate the thought. That's really cool. Yeah, people don't often think about, in case you didn't hear it, that person suggested that aliens are very aware that humans have nukes. You know, I can understand that. If I was an alien traveler and I saw a planet filled with a bunch of people that had these thermonuclear devices, I might hesitate a little bit to see what they're up to. Maybe I'll watch them from afar. So interesting. And so it's not that they couldn't have visited, but it's that they didn't because of the nukes. And I'm curious to see if that made you laugh. The rule is you got to switch to the other side. So anyways, time. And I'm going to pause there, but I want to thank you guys for your participation. And yeah, I guess we'll take some questions.
Thanks, Anthony. I actually did want to jump in because there was an interesting question that came in about, is time debunking better spent aimed at those who are open to hearing both sides? And while you're going through your game, I was like, is this game building our skill to hear both sides? Is that effectively what it's doing? But so the full question is around, is it better spent on the folks who are open to that? Because this particular commenter mentioned that they found that confirmation bias is a major hurdle when speaking with people that seem to have made up their mind about which side is right. I wonder if you could speak to that.
It's a really, really good question. I would say that the data seems to suggest that you can reach both groups, but you ought not to be using the same strategy for both groups. So for groups that are a bit closer to the center and they're a bit more, they're like, maybe I'd get the vaccine, but I need to hear a bit more about it. Like the ones that are open, the suite of science communication techniques that we typically would use, and the ones that Tim and Krishana and that everybody before spoke about, those are super effective. Debunking works. Those are really good strategies. What I'm aiming to tackle with this platform is those people who are sort of the fringe groups who are a lot more sort of fixed in their ways. And those groups, you need a different strategy because, again, they tend to occupy these highly polarized kinds of environments, and they tend to be very resistant to change from people they view as outsiders. And so this tool is designed to help bridge the gap between outsider and insider for those smaller groups. I think that, there's a study by Chris Bale out of Duke University that highlighted the fact that, it's around 75% of the content that you see on Twitter, in particular political content, it comes from something like 6% of users. And those users happen to be the most polarized. And so being able to reach those highly polarized fringe groups actually can take a big bite out of the kind of, the scale of the misinformation that we tend to see online. So I do think that it's quite worthwhile to reach out to those kinds of groups. I just think we need a different tool set to be able to reach them.
Okay. Thank you. And you know what, actually, I'm going to bring everybody back to the main stage. Now we have, just over 15 minutes to power through some of the questions that have come in and for a little bit of a wrap up. I don't know if you've seen them rolling in, but we're doing rapid fire. Okay. We're gonna get through these questions. I want to honor everyone who's participating in that chat room. Thank you. I'm going to throw the first one out to Timothy. So this one is, what can be done at the population level rather than just one-on-one or in small groups and communities? So this question goes on. It says, in a passive way, rather than asking people to know about and go to websites with solid information, how can we take a page from those who spread misinformation?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say I agree with all of my presenters, all the above. So I think that's one place to start. But this is an incredibly complex social phenomenon. So you're not going to be surprised by my answer. We've got to use a multi-prong approach. So we need regulators to do more. So Health Canada, FDA, FTC, the Competition Bureau. We've got to stop those who are spreading misinformation. We need to have those who regulate health professionals who are spreading misinformation, College of Physicians and Surgeons, et cetera, to do more. We've got to teach better critical thinking and media literacy skills. And there is good evidence that can make a difference. And that also can involve some pre-bunking kinds of strategies. That needs to happen. And yes, we have to think about trust, and we have to think about how we can create institutions that individuals can trust and continue to find trustworthy. And we have to use these broad debunking skills. But let's just talk about one scalable intervention. My colleague Gordon Pennycook and David Rand, he's from MIT, Gordon Pennycook from University of Regina, and their collaborators, they've done fantastic work around the idea of getting people just to pause, to reflect, to take a moment. And that is a scalable intervention. So what do I mean by that? Their research has found that if you can just nudge people to pause and perhaps invite them to read the headline and consider how accurate is that, they're less likely to believe misinformation, less likely to spread misinformation. So that's a scalable intervention. I love this research because it's scalable, but it's also kind of relevant to ourselves personally. I remind myself to do that, by the way, to pause for a moment. But you can make a real difference. Now, the other interesting thing about their research, and this builds on something everyone has said, most people want to be accurate. Most people value accuracy, right? Most people don't have a malevolent agenda to spread misinformation. I think their work, Gordon's work, found that over 80% of people will identify the reality that it's important to be accurate on social media, and you should always check before you share. We're not doing that, obviously. That's why we need those kinds of nudges. I could go on, Marianne, but those are just a few suggestions. It's a great question.
I'm going to give the opportunity if any of the other panelists want to kind of riff off of what Tim just said, or otherwise I can certainly move on to another question.
I just wanted to add something. So obviously phenomenal. I think another huge piece with population level and everything that Tim said is a lot of the transparency. So the transparency around the communication needs to happen. We saw that didn't happen very well during this pandemic, which led to a lot of frustration and mistrust in the population. And I know this is not necessarily largely population, but more so community population. And so I think it's important to have leaders and influencers within communities, give them the tools so that they can then disseminate the information. So a lot of capacity building, I think, is really important as well. So I just wanted to add that.
I'd love to jump in and reinforce what Tim said about pausing for a moment. That sense of calm. Social media is in many ways designed to sort of, it's not a new thing to say that it's designed to sort of outrage us. And the more outraged we are, the easier it is to click and share. And so if we can do things to calm that sense of outrage, then we can think a lot more clearly. And there's some interesting research that suggests if we do something called self-distancing, which is to sort of imagine yourself in third person browsing through social media or as you're journaling, it allows you to take yourself less seriously. It allows you to step out of that sort of social threat mindset and think much more clearly. I always say that the best way to tell that somebody is calm is to see whether or not they're able to laugh at themselves. So if you notice that while you're browsing through social media, you're not able to laugh at yourself or the situation, then maybe pause a little bit longer before you hit the send button.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Josh.
I was going to say, I think a lot about how to scale stuff up, and really you can scale many things up if you have like resources and organizational capacity, right? I think about every electoral cycle in the US, right? Where you recruit like tens of millions of people to like try to win an election. And I think like love all the presenters, like all the work we do is really cool. It's scope is small though, right? Like if I gave Tim $1 billion, he could probably do a lot more, like basically. And frankly, I think when it comes to misinformation, or any of you guys $1 billion, like it really is eating away at the fabric of society. Like COVID cost society like probably $1 trillion at least, right? And so finding those, like it's not necessarily that hard to scale if it's well resourced and organized. And so I hope we find better ways to sort of mobilize and marshal those resources.
I also wanted to just come back to Patrick on this topic, because obviously you work with very specific communities. And so this idea of, scaling or working at a population level, are there aspects of your kind of working model that you think can kind of be applied at a larger scale?
Yes, certainly. Although I do think that the approach at the lab, universities have come a long way in supporting people that do want to have the boots on the ground and build those relationships. But there's still a lot of aspects of maintaining those relationships that are not exactly recognized as research. And when they're not recognized, I think it makes it a lot tougher to scale that into new environments. It can't be like one lab that's doing it. And yeah, so I think universities have come a long way in supporting what we would call like doing research in a good way, respecting community and listening to community and respecting culture. But I still think that there is some work to be done so that this kind of work is just more feasible for other researchers to do as well. But yeah, I definitely think like there's enough researchers in the country to be engaging with these communities. And I think it's, like I said, it's going to be important to kind of identify more specifically where the work is needed before the next crisis emerges and before people start to build those very emotionally driven opinions on data. Because once they're already firm in that place, then it's like 3 times as much work to change their opinion instead of having that trust in science from the outset and just going from there, and then just being transparent, like we said, with the uncertainty maybe in our data in those early stages as stuff is changing. But the way media covers the work we do also has a big role to play. And I think something has to change there. Yeah.
Do you want to unpack that a little bit?
Well, I think like I'm getting partially distracted by the dogs here. It's close
I can't hear them.
It's close to time for their stroll. And I use the word stroll because the other word would have dogs jumping all over me. But
well, they're welcome to join us on screen if they make an appearance. I do talking about this conversation of kind of scale and kind of at that population level. I have a question that I'm going to send to Job, and this is, as we maintain and continue to engage different sectors. So you've done this work across business, schools, NGOs, to deliver accurate and scientific information. How can the lessons learned through what we've all experienced in COVID be applied through different topics into the future? Other issues other than COVID?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the core of these collaborations are relationships, right? And so, normally me and, rural evangelical pastor are not best friends, but like once you make a relationship, then you can begin to convey other issues, right? Other health issues, other science issues. And I think that so long as, I love what people said, right? Like I forgot, like if somebody knows you care about them, then that is like the core of actually getting people to change their behavior. And in a way, when it comes to scale, I think that there's some things where you can just like buy an ad campaign, that's money, but like relationships can also be scaled if you just have the organizational ability to do it, right? Again, if you can find people to like talk to people who know how to talk to people, it can be done. I think that one of the best things about COVID really has been a lot of these intersectoral collaborations, and it'd be really sad if we sort of lost them. And so again, take your friend out for a beer or something. Like it works pretty well, I think.
So much. I'm gonna keep pulling these questions from the audience. That's when Krishan, it's going out to you, and actually if others want to comment. How to best equip folks to deal with the uncertainty inherent to an evolving situation where knowledge and recommendations change over time. You could be someone who's general trusting of government and scientists, but find uncertainty very destabilizing.
Yeah, this is a tough one. This is the one that has been causing a lot of issues all throughout the pandemic. And I think at its core, it comes back to what Tim mentioned, which is basically we need to be teaching. It's a science literacy thing. It's also a critical thinking thing. I think it has to start from there. It has to start from literally from when we're young, but continuing to teach people as we get older, and as well as continuing to reinforce this, right? That this is just how science is. It's an evolving field. As we keep learning, as information keeps coming in, things keep evolving, and this is how we learn and put information together, and this is how policies are created due to all the evolving information coming in. But that this is normal. So I think we have to have larger conversations around it so people start to feel more comfortable with uncertainty. The huge issue is people just feel extremely uncomfortable with uncertainty. And so making it more, like normalizing it more, speaking about it more, teaching about it more, I think is what is really needed in having those conversations. So people start to appreciate that, okay, if for example, masking at first, right? It was not recommended. Then it was recommended. And a lot of the communications through the WHO and other organizations where a lot of people felt things were said one way versus, the very next day it was, something else was said. So there was a lot of trust that was, people were feeling as though their trust was being broken. They felt as though they couldn't trust scientists and other experts, but it was more so because a lot of the communication around what was happening, in my opinion, was not clear. It also was not really explained quite like very well. It was not very transparent. And then also just that teaching moment of, okay, this is just how science works. It's okay. This is how things move. So yeah, that's what I think. It's a multifactorial thing. It's like we have to start from young, a lot of science literacy, but we have to continue the conversation going forward as well.
Thanks. And I'm going to pull Tim up to respond to, I know, Tim, you dropped a link in the discussion area. Thanks for that.
Yeah, I agree completely with Christiana, and I just want to emphasize one point, and that's this is how science happens. You know, people are watching science play out for the first time, right? In many respects, and science is messy. It's slow. People contradict, and that's one of the reasons I think you always want to refer to the body of evidence, the scientific consensus. We need to do that more often in the popular press, and I think we need to invite people along for the scientific journey and to let people know it's never going to be one small study from France that was a preprint. It's never going to be, one small even clinical trial. It's always the body of evidence, especially when you're talking about something as complex as COVID. And the other thing it reminds us to do is avoid that false balance, right? The creation of this illusion of certainty on one side or the other. Dogma is almost always a mistake, right? And so I think we need to remind ourselves of that. And as Christiana says, get people to be more sensitized to the reality that uncertainty is the norm, and it really is about that scientific journey.
Yeah, it's actually, and so I think there's a question early on in the chat box that spoke to this phenomenon of, people are spreading misinformation in early days. Maybe they're criticized, oh, you don't have any references. And then they went out and got some references. And maybe they're problematic references from a research point of view, right? And so the question is basically, how can we effectively deal with that phenomenon? And I'm going to throw that, Tim, I think you have something to say just as a
No, I'll leave it. I want to hear from my colleagues.
And I was going to throw it out to Anthony as well.
Yeah, so I love what Christiana and Tim have had to say about this. I think that they're absolutely right that, part of what we have to do is really build a science culture. And by that, I mean, if culture is a collection of values and ideas and beliefs that are shared by a group of people across time, then science culture is a collection of values and ideals and beliefs that are conducive to good science. And I think there are a couple of them that we really ought to highlight, and anybody who's talked to me knows the ones that I think are really important. I call them the 5 C's, but really it's about building that understanding that science is not what you think, it's how. It's a process, and it's an important part of what certainly us at Science Everywhere we've been aiming to do, and what I know that each of my colleagues have been trying to do as well, is to foster that greater sense of comfort with being unsure, because that's the reality of science. And so, when we ask a question like, have aliens come to Earth? The goal of getting people to laugh in the middle of a game like that is literally to get people more comfortable with that uncertainty. It's to practice. And I think that's the way that we get there. There's not a thing I'm going to be able to say to somebody to help them all of a sudden recognize, oh, uncertainty, that's how science works. I'm going to stop worrying about all of the problems. I think it really is a practice that we have to engage in on a regular basis. So yeah, I mean, I'll leave it open. I'll leave it there for the rest of my colleagues to add to, but that would be my sense about how we deal with this.
Well, we're winding down. We're down to the final minutes of this chat. I'm going to do a quick thing. I'm going to put you on the spot with a one answer, yes or no. We'll go around the room. Are we ready for the next pandemic? Tim?
No.
Anthony?
We're getting better.
Yeah, I mean, it's not yes or no, but yes, I'll say yes. I'll say yes.
Ja.
Better, but no.
Christiana?
Ditto. Better, but no, definitely not.
And Patrick?
I'm going to have to stick with the majority here and go with no.
Okay.
I'm an optimist.
So I kind of thought we were going to lean that way. What I've heard over the discussion today was an emphasis on relationships and trust. And I wasn't sure that's what was going to emerge for me as my takeaway. I thought it was going to be collaboration or something, but that is what has boiled to the top. You guys have about 10 seconds to think. If you had a word or two as your what boiled to the top, it can be the same. That's okay. Again, we're just going to finish off with kind of those final few words. People are walking away from this. What are they getting? I am getting trust and relationships and time. We'll start with Patrick. We'll go the other way.
Yeah, those and also like nuance, I guess, each community.
Savannah.
I guess building up science literacy.
Yeah, Ja?
Scale up the good stuff.
Yeah, Anthony, and then Tim. Tim.
Oh, I'm going to go with empathy. You know, it's something I have to remind myself of because I get so angry and frustrated. But I loved what everyone said. It's so important to have these conversations. So let's all try to remind ourselves to be kind and be empathetic.
Thank you. And Anthony, I missed your word. I think you can say it.
Oh, I said curiosity, collaboration, and calm. Yeah, 3 of the
Excellent.
5 C's.
Thank you, everyone, for a tremendous session. Obviously, it could have gone longer. Thank you to the audience for your questions. And everyone, have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.